Hello and welcome to this first episode of the 3 on NY-3 podcast, focusing exclusively on the race for Congress in New York's new 3rd District. I'm Andrew Whitman. I'm an unemployed political journalist who just happens to live in the 3rd District. I've spent most of the past 15 years as the senior political correspondent for FiOS 1 News and for RNN Television. A few weeks ago, I was asked to moderate an online forum among the 6 current Democratic candidates for Congress in NY-3. You can watch that forum on this show's YouTube page. Just search for 3 on NY-3 or search for my name on YouTube. And after that forum, I realized a few things. It was really, frankly, the first time I had been interested in covering politics again since the end of my time on the air. Also, that because of the odd confines of this new district, which stretches from Suffolk and Nassau counties through Queens and the Bronx and into Westchester, I didn't know most of the candidates all that well, and I imagine I'm not the only one in that position. And I also realized that because of its odd nature, the district probably won't get the media coverage and the context it deserves. And that's why I'm doing this. It's pickup journalism. I was walking by the court, I saw a game I wanted to jump into, even though I hadn't wanted to play for a minute, so I'm getting involved. Most episodes of 3 on NY-3 are going to feature the Democratic candidates in New York 3. We'll add the Republicans later on since their primary right now is not a competitive one. Other special episodes are going to feature experts on individual sections of the district, so we can all better get to know the disparate parts of our district and its voters and its politics. I'm guessing, for example, that some people in Nassau may not know that much about Westchester or its politics. Same thing for people in Westchester, in the Bronx, in Queens, and in Suffolk. And this episode, our first, is going to be one of those. We're going to dissect and discuss the Westchester portion of New York 3 with a man who knows it well, New Rochelle's Democratic Mayor Noam Bramson. Bramson has been mayor of New Rochelle, which is in the 3rd, or at least part of it is in the 3rd. We'll get to that in the middle of the interview. Anyway, he's been the mayor since 2006. He's also a Democratic strategist, and in 2013, he was the Democratic nominee for Westchester County Executive. So here now, my interview with New Rochelle Mayor Noam Bramson. Mr. Mayor, welcome to the podcast. Thank you for being the guinea pig as the first guest that we're having on the program.
It's a pleasure to be with you, Andrew, and I'm glad to reconnect with you for any reason at all.
It's been too long, and so I really do appreciate it. Let's start with any disclaimers or disclosures that need to be done. Are you endorsing formally any candidate in this race? Are you supporting any of the candidates in this race?
I have not endorsed any candidate in the race, and I'm unsure as to whether I will endorse any candidate in the race.
Oh, good to know. I'm going to do a little bit of disclosing myself. After I left RNN last year and was unemployed for the first time since 2004, I went through my address book and reached out to a number of my contacts, including a number of elected officials, and heard back from very few of them. You were one of them, and I'm very grateful for that long phone call. We talked about politics in general and possible futures and things like that. It meant a lot then. It means a lot now. So thank you.
It was my honor.
All right, so let's go into some of the details of the district as best we can. And first, I want to start with the district itself. And whenever I take a look at this district, my first thought is this is a Long Island district that just has pieces of the Bronx and Queens and Westchester County sort of wedged into it. Do you get the same sense when you look at the map and based on what you know of the area?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very difficult to escape that conclusion. Obviously, the bulk of the geography and the bulk of the population is within Nassau and Suffolk counties. There's no denying that. And I think most people probably on both sides of Long Island Sound, when they first saw these district lines, did a little bit of a double take. Because at least to the best of my knowledge, Westchester has not been connected with Long Island in any previous iteration of a congressional district, certainly not in generations if it happened maybe farther back historically. And yet, the more I reflect on it, the more I find it to be acceptable. I mean, this is by and large a suburban New York City district. There are pieces, as you pointed out, of the 5 boroughs, but it's predominantly suburban New York. These are communities that do surround Long Island Sound and have a commonality of interest associated with the Sound. If you include the water, then it appears geographically compact. If you exclude the water, maybe less so. And although I understand the theoretical concern that if you have Westchester comprising a relatively small share of the district, it might be overlooked by a congressional representative. As a practical matter, and I say this as someone who worked for a member of Congress, it just doesn't it doesn't turn out that way. Members of Congress, if they are wise, are responsive to all portions of their district and make it clear both in the atmospherics and in the substance of what they do that communities in any corner of their district are well represented. So I'm not really concerned going forward about the quality of representation for New Rochelle or the quality of representation for Westchester Sound Shore broadly.
And we'll revisit some parts of that a little bit later on in the interview. When I was trying to roughly estimate what portion of the district's voters are in the Westchester County slice of the district, at first I was a little over 200,000. Then I realized that New Rochelle had been chopped into pieces. Again, more on that in a little bit. Now I've got it ballpark at about 175,000 people. That's maybe a fifth of the district. Does that feel about right to you?
Yeah, that sounds about right. I mean, I haven't done the calculation, so, give or take a few percentage points, but I think that's in the ballpark.
Okay. And the initial formation of the district, we know that the state legislature, dominated by Democrats, wanted to make as Democrat friendly a congressional map of New York State as possible. It seems like the way they do that, the way you do that in general is you build a district that has as many Republicans in it as possible. That's going to be the new second district. And then you take the remaining portions, let's say of Long Island, and you carve the boundaries so that it includes Democrats to give Democrats the advantages there. The notion being that in the third district, they extended what was more of a mixed district in Nassau and Suffolk, and those parts of Westchester as well as the Bronx and Queens should be laden with Democratic votes to help give the advantage that they want. And by the estimates I've seen, it's about a 10-point advantage for Democrats generically in the district. That roughly the way these kinds of things work?
Yeah, I mean, you're describing to some degree the dark arts of gerrymandering.
Right.
I don't, to be clear, I don't have experience drawing lines at the state level, but I think that's right. And look, there are multiple factors that have to be harmonized whenever you're drawing district lines. You need to equalize population. There are voting rights considerations. There may be partisan considerations, as you pointed out. There's a desire to keep communities of interest whole. And any given redistricting plan will balance those different considerations in different ratios. I don't think there's any denying that this plan for New York State is intended to strengthen the Democratic hold on our congressional delegation. I'm of the view that if we could nationwide dispense with partisan gerrymandering and have district lines drawn on a strictly nonpartisan basis by commissions, that would be good for our democracy and good for America. But I don't think it's reasonable to expect Democrats to do that unilaterally. If states such as Texas and Florida and others are going to be gerrymandered in such a way that it advantages Republican candidates, I do think one has to expect that Democratic-controlled states are going to do the reverse.
And just to be clear, creating a bluer district, a more Democratic district like the new third is, doesn't necessarily mean you're making it a more progressive district. It's just Democrats in ratio to Republicans. This is not talking about how liberal or progressive or Democratic the district may be.
Yes, that's absolutely true. Although the Democratic performance of a district and its progressive nature are related, they are distinct. And you need no better example of that than New York City, which in a general election is overwhelmingly Democratic, and yet elected recently as mayor the candidate who I think most people would probably judge among the moderates, if not the most moderate in the field. So you are correct. And by the way, it's also the case that a district like New York 3, and I think you're right, it has probably a 10 to 15 point Democratic edge, all things being equal.
Right.
This is a year in which it does not look as though all things will be equal. This is going to be, by all accounts, a red-leaning, a Republican-leaning year. And it is quite possible that in that context, New York 3 will be competitive. That's in contrast, say, to New York 16, which is the other half of New Rochelle up through the Hudson Valley, where the Democratic primary is the end of the ballgame. The general election is a formality in a district like that.
But there may be a correlation, Noam, in that having a very Democratic district provides the opportunity, the setting, if you will, for a more progressive candidate to potentially emerge. Whereas in a more divided district, it's less likely that a candidate from either end of the political spectrum is probably going to win a general election.
Yes, but I think that depends as much on the nature of the primary electorate as it does on the nature of the general electorate. And by the way, it's difficult to generalize about these things because every district has its own personality.
Sure.
The candidate has their own profile. But I accept your general point.
I appreciate that. Thank you very much. Let's move on now and start looking at the Westchester portion of the district. And nope, that's not. And as we go through it, it hugs the Sound Shore as you were talking about. And let's take a look. It starts with New Rochelle to the south, but let's start from the north. We've got Rybrook and Portchester and Rye, both the city and the village, Mamaroneck, Larchmont, Pelham, including Pelham Manor and the village of Pelham, and at least part of the city of New Rochelle. I'm assuming for the purposes of this podcast that nobody outside of the Westchester portion of the district knows the Westchester portion of the district. So these are suburban communities, New Rochelle being the most urban of them. There's a Metro North rail link that connects all of these villages. There are what I like to think of as suburban downtown areas in all of them near those train stations where you have businesses and apartments on top of businesses. New Rochelle being the one that really has a true downtown in the way that people think of it. Most of the rest of the district are suburban, what people would think of as generic suburban areas, single family homes, apartments, condos, lots of commuters. What else can you think of to describe the district itself for people who aren't familiar with?
I think you got it right. This is the New Haven Line district. Just about all the stations on the New Haven Line are contained within it or close to it. And I think you're correct that it is predominantly classic suburbia, but it certainly does have urbanized areas within the southern portion of New Rochelle, as well as Portchester, I'd say. As a more dense and urbanized community. I'm generalizing, but
as a Portchester resident, I'll agree with you.
Yeah, and the more classically suburban single-family neighborhoods in New Rochelle, the lion's share of them are north of 95, which is the dividing line, and so it's the more densely populated portion of New Rochelle that is within this district, about a third of New Rochelle. As you said, aside from New Rochelle and Portchester, these are largely suburban environments.
You ran in all of these municipalities in 2013 in your campaign for county executive. What do we know about the demographics of voters along the Sound Shore, if we know anything at all? I mean, you would assume that there would probably be a higher than average income level, probably a higher than average education. Are lots of commuters, again, as I was saying before, more white collar than necessarily blue collar. Am I on with these generalizations, or am I risking ignoring parts of the population?
Well, I think from 20,000 feet, that's probably accurate. Certainly, communities like Rye and Larchmont and portions of Mamaroneck, Pelham Manor, portions of Pelham. Some of them are among the wealthiest communities in America. On the other hand, there are a spectrum of circumstances and socioeconomic conditions and demographic characteristics. Just as we said, there are other areas such as New Rochelle and Portchester, which are more urbanized and more diverse by every metric. So I wouldn't want to paint with an overly broad brush, but it is certainly true that this portion of the district contains areas that are very upscale, white collar, and quite wealthy.
This one was challenging me as I was trying to answer it myself. I was looking for unique entities inside the Westchester slice of the district that might require, an outsized amount of federal attention or money or assistance or protection. Uh, there's no military base in this portion of the district. I think part of the aqueduct, the water aqueduct that brings water into the city, might go through it, although I'm not sure. Rye Playland might be a focus on the federal. Is there anything that in the district that you know of that somebody in Congress would want to keep a good eye on, or might need the attention on the federal level?
Well, I mean, let's start with Long Island Sound. One of the most significant water bodies in America. It's critical to our environment. It's critical to our economy, critical to our quality of life and our property values. And the federal government has historically played quite a significant role in safeguarding Long Island Sound water quality and providing funding. I remember when I worked for Congresswoman Lowy years ago, and when she represented a district that included the Sound Shore, it was among her top priorities, among her most consistent priorities. And I would certainly expect, especially with the addition of Long Island, that whoever emerges as the representative will be very attentive to the needs of the Sound. Beyond that, you have significant regional projects like Penn Access, which will connect Metro North's New Haven line to Penn Station. Now, that's primarily a state initiative, and it seems to be, no pun intended, it seems to be on track. So it may be that no federal intervention will be necessary to get us over the goal line, but I certainly think that any representative would want to keep one eye on that, recognizing how important it is. And then there are local priorities which may have a federal nexus. And I'll just use one that I'm familiar with because it's in New
Yeah.
Rochelle, a project called the Link, which repurposes an old overbuilt highway into a linear park. Tremendously important initiative. And we recently won I think it was a $13 million federal RAISE grant, a highly competitive grant through the Department of Transportation. Now, again, that's already banked away, but it's the kind of thing on which
Sure.
we did need and would need federal support. And I'm confident that the other communities along the Sound Shore would have similar local initiatives that would benefit from federal dollars.
That's exactly the kind of thing that would escape the eye of the general public or the media, and I'm glad you brought that up. Let's move on to national issues. Which national issues do you think will resonate in the Westchester portion of the district? You already mentioned Long Island Sound and, by extension, climate change, which it was a big issue in the forum that I hosted with the candidates, and obviously, considering that the entire district borders Long Island Sound, that will be a major issue. What else do you think? I mean, obviously, jobs and the economy and cost of living are a big issue everywhere. What else comes to mind?
Yeah, look, I think any one of us off the top of our heads can probably name the top issues, and you've named a couple of them. Certainly, climate action is, I think, important to all of us, particularly important to Democratic primary voters. Jobs in the economy, a perennial issue that's important to people across the political spectrum, protection of civil rights and civil liberties, including standing up for groups that have been historically marginalized. I think that is a deeply important value for Democrats, an increasingly important value. And I have to say, affirming the importance of our democratic institutions, small d democratic institutions, in the face of a growing wave of autocracy and a near coup in 2020. And I think that is a priority that is sort of existential in nature in terms of the durability of our democracy. And it's one on which Democrats need to find ways to make common cause with Republicans who may disagree sharply on public policy questions, but may be equally committed to democratic governance.
What about local issues in the district? Taxes are always an issue when Westchester voters go to the polls. I'm curious about that. Do you think that the Republican issue point of schools and what's being taught in schools is something that will resonate in Westchester, whether that's germane to a congressional race or not, and what other local issues pop to mind?
Well, certainly taxes are an issue in the New York suburbs. In absolute terms, we pay in Westchester the highest property taxes in the nation. I don't know the stats for sure for Nassau and Suffolk, but I assume they're right up there. It's a lesser amount as a share of property value, which is an important caveat to that. But even so, in terms of out-of-pocket expenses, it's a significant hit for many, many families. And that was exacerbated by the limitation on the state and local tax deduction, SALT.
Right.
The outgoing congressman for this district, Tom Suozzi, certainly made it a priority to restore the SALT exemption. And I would expect that whoever emerges as the next congressperson will probably take that up as a priority as well. So yeah, that is certainly an issue.
I would expect we'll hear about repealing the SALT law from just about everybody who's running for the seat. That seems like a big one. I want to focus in on turnout, if we could. There's going to be a gubernatorial race on the top of the ticket this year, but there's no presidential race. There's no Senate race. So it's the gubernatorial race and then congressional races at the top of the ticket. Does the Sound Shore part of Westchester tend to turn out for these kinds of primaries?
I don't know. Look, what I can say confidently is that only a small fraction of the potential electorate will turn out in the primary. You know, a high turnout primary is something like 25%.
Right.
You know, so in the best case scenario, most people are going to sit it out. And the folks who do turn out are likely to those who are most interested in politics, follow it most closely, feel the greatest allegiance to one candidate or another. But whether Westchester will turn out in comparatively greater numbers than Long Island or Queens or the Bronx, I just don't know enough to answer that.
But there are groups that tend to push voters out, particularly in low turnout primaries. Party establishment, so local Democratic committees might do so, unions might do so, outside interest groups might do so as well.
Well, those groups, the specific groups you cited, are more likely to be engaged in the general election than they are in the primary, unless they have specifically endorsed one of the candidates. And I'm sure some of the unions will endorse. It could be that some of the local committees will endorse, but many others will not get involved in the primary and will confine their efforts to the general. I think the bulk of the organizing and the mobilization will probably be generated by the candidates and the campaigns themselves.
When we start to focus in on the Democratic primary, we get to it's a rough term, a rough metric for measuring it, but the Biden versus Bernie split, if you will, the mainstream versus progressive divides among Democratic voters in the county. And to talk about those trends, we need to do a little bit of a history lesson. So if you'll just bear with me for a moment as I do this, the county has had a long-term Democratic registration advantage in terms of voters, nearly 2-to-1 or more so for at least the entire time that I've been covering politics in Westchester County. And yet, before 2017, had only elected 2 Democratic county executives in its history. Sorry about that, sir. That includes the race for 2013. Generally has voted Democratic for federal elections, but again, we wound up with moderate or mainstream Democrats like Nita Lowey or Elliot Engel. Then came 2016, the election of Donald Trump. And in the following year, we saw the rise of progressive mobilization groups, especially the indivisible groups across Westchester. And they led to the election of George Latimer as a Democratic county executive in 2017, who I would put as more of a moderate Biden, Cuomo kind of Democrat as opposed to a progressive. And then in the years after that, you saw progressives elected to the state Senate, to the county board of legislators in Westchester from the Sound Shore area, and also to members of Congress. We saw Jamal Bowman and Mondaire Jones elected to the county's 2 congressional seats in the aftermath. That feels like there's been a bit of a progressive wave, or at least certainly an impact that progressives have had on Democratic politics in the county and on the Sound Shore. I'm wondering if you agree and if you think that's going to continue.
I agree in the broad strokes. I mean, again, with the usual and important caveat that every election is different, every candidate is different, and in each of the races you cited, there are specific, unique circumstances that could explain the outcome separate and apart from these broad trends. So we should always keep that in mind. But yes, I do agree that certainly, at a minimum, between 2016 and 2020, there was an unusual level of energy on the progressive side of the Democratic Party, and that was evidenced in a bunch of the outcomes. How much of that was a reaction to Donald Trump, and how much of that reflected an underlying durable change in the preferences and goals of Democratic primary voters is, I think, an untested proposition right now. And the elections that are going to unfold this year will be an interesting test on that level. And by the way, although some of the things that are associated with progressives or moderates might be programmatic or ideological, in my experience, it's more of a stylistic difference. That the level of agreement when you get down to public policy is often quite high. Mm-hmm. But I'd say so-called moderates tend to be more institutionalists, tend to more think in terms of coordinated team action, even if that requires some level of compromise in order to achieve a pragmatic objective. Whereas so-called progressives may tend to be more sort of purists in an approach, and more interested in clarity in terms of values and goals, even if that sometimes means standing apart from the team. And either of those approaches can be effective or ineffective, depending on the specific context and the times and the issue. And I don't think anyone really finds themselves entirely at one extreme or the other. It's more that people position themselves at different points along that spectrum.
I think that's more than fair. But when you're looking at primary candidates and trying to figure out which candidates might face the greater advantages in any particular area, you do have to sort of try to find those lines of distinction, even if in the aggregate, it's really not that big of a distinction. You also talked about the ongoing trend in Westchester. I'll point out that in 2021, George Latimer won re-election pretty easily. Yeah. And we're at the point where 15 of the 17 seats in the county board of legislators are Democratic. Again, that's not indicative of the progressive versus more establishment or more moderate Democrats, but I would assume that part of that is the impact of the progressive movement. And as we get away from or further away from the election of Donald Trump and his administration, it might be less of a reflection on anti-Trump sentiment.
Yeah, and look, I think what you have in Westchester is both short-term and long-term trends converging and moving in the same direction. The long-term trend has been sort of the bluification of Westchester. I mean, historically, it was a Republican bedrock, which is why, as you pointed out, there have only been, before George, a couple of Democratic county executives.
Sorry.
Yeah, I know. Ouch, right? But I've got an over it. So there's been this long-term shift that is also consistent with movement in many suburbs, movement particularly among well-educated voters towards the Democratic Party. That trend was supercharged during the Trump years. I don't think there's any reason to believe that the long-term trend is going to reverse, but whether it will continue at the same pace or whether it may retreat a little bit from its high watermark, that still remains to be seen.
So just to button this part of the conversation up, my first reaction when I looked at the map is that the Westchester portion of the district and probably Queens and the Bronx, but I'll ask those experts about that, probably would favor or tend to favor a more progressive leaning Democratic primary candidate, whereas the Nassau and Suffolk portions probably wouldn't. Do you agree with that generalization, or do you think it's too there are too many other specifics that could shatter that.
I just don't know because I'm not sufficiently familiar with Nassau and Suffolk to draw a comparison.
But at least for the Westchester portion.
I think we'll see. I mean, again, depending on how you define the terms, although I haven't seen the data broken out by this portion of Westchester, I think it's overwhelmingly likely that this portion of Westchester voted for Hillary Clinton over Bernie Sanders. And I think it's overwhelmingly likely that had Biden not already wrapped up the nomination by the time it got to New York, that Biden or a similar candidate like Pete Buttigieg would probably have won in this portion of Westchester. So it's complicated,
as it always is. And I do want to point out that the primary election that led Congressman Mondaire Jones to the general election, which includes the northern part of the Sound Shore district, that was a 7-way primary race, I think, that he won. And I think that may be one of the dynamics that you were referring to about specific races. Maybe you get a different outcome if there are 3 candidates on that ballot as opposed to 7.
Quite possible. Although in that specific race, as I recall, Mondaire's margin was so large, unexpectedly large to many people, that he may well have prevailed even in a smaller field. But as a general matter, absolutely. How the field gets sliced up among different candidates can have a profound impact on the ultimate result.
Earlier,
a good reason, I'll do a public service announcement, why we ought to have ranked choice voting, because it's a much more effective way of ensuring that the will of the voters is actually translated into representation. But that's neither here nor there. It's not going to happen in time for this primary, that's for sure.
This message brought to you by Noam Bramson for ranked choice voting.
Exactly.
I'm looking forward to those disclaimer parts at the end of all the political ads that we've got coming as political season heats up. Earlier in our conversation, we talked a little bit about quality of representation, especially in areas that are split or share representatives. And you've had a taste of that in the current Congress. You've been mayor since 2006 in the district that started in 2012 and runs out through this year. New Rochelle and Southern Westchester are combined with the Bronx in the 16th district, represented by Jamal Bowman, formerly by Elliot Engel, correct?
Correct.
Has it one of my concerns was always that, well, a member of Congress who's dealing with Yonkers, Mount Vernon, and New Rochelle, and the Bronx is probably going to be more focused on the needs of the Bronx because that's where more votes are coming from. Have you found that to be the case when New Rochelle has sort of been the younger child in those dynamics?
I really have not. And I totally get the theory. And yet, as a practical matter, that's just not how it's played out. A congressperson who either ignores or who gives the impression of ignoring sizable chunks of their district, even if those chunks are a minority of the district, will not remain in office very long. It is in the interests of a congressperson, both from a public spirited perspective and in terms of their own political health, to be attentive and to be seen as attentive to the needs of all of the communities that they represent. And I've just not seen evidence of New Rochelle or other communities being neglected based on a sort of a population count. And although you didn't ask this exactly, a sort of a related point is that splitting a community does not necessarily work to the disadvantage of that community. And here our experience really comes down to our state legislative lines. Until this most recent round of redistricting, New Rochelle was split both in the state Senate and in the state Assembly. And initially, I think many people's reaction was, well, New Rochelle should be united in a single district. That makes a lot more sense. We'd have clear lines of representation. In fact, what we've discovered is because our city was split, we had double the representation. We had 4 members of our state delegation instead of just 2. And all of them were attentive and responsive. So I'm not particularly concerned. As the mayor of New Rochelle, I have no worries about whether we will be represented well in this new configuration. I think we will be.
I was going to ask about that, having new represent or being divided among two different districts, because you're about to hit that with the third district and the 16th. So I assume then if you've got an issue that affects the city, you can reach out to both of them, even if it's not specific to their portion of the city. Has that been your experience in the past?
It depends on the issue. If it's a highly localized neighborhood matter, or if it is, say, funding for a park that serves a particular neighborhood, then in a case like that, we would likely look for the particular representative who covers that geography. If it is something more citywide in nature, or if it is a facility that may have a particular location but serves the entirety of New Rochelle, then we would certainly reach out to all of our representatives.
So tell me about I'm going to ask you about the split in New Rochelle and what parts are in and what parts aren't, for people who don't know or who have only traveled past New Rochelle, either on the train or on I-95. It has a lot in common with the other communities on the Sound Shore. There are, uniquely suburban areas with self-standing homes. Some of them go back to, 100 years or more. The house, my ex-wife was a big fan of the musical and the movie Ragtime, which was set in 1903 New Rochelle. And we spent a day looking for the house in that movie. And we think we found it. Yeah, we think.
Okay. Yeah.
And it's on a street with other 20-room houses that, you could misplace for being in Scarsdale or Chappaqua or some other tonier suburban community. There is also the parts by, let's say, North Avenue and by Iona that feel like they could be from downtown Rye or downtown Larchmont, stores on the street level and apartments on top of them. And then you have a downtown area that has high rises, has really a concentration of more classically urban features. You have or had a Trump building at one point in downtown New Rochelle. Have I described the city accurately, which I almost never do? And then of those parts of the city, which parts are in the third, which are in the 16th?
You've described it very, very well. And it's part of the reason I love living here and love governing here, is that you do have a little bit of everything. In human terms and in land use terms. So you have it exactly right. Neighborhoods that are historic and charming, areas that are high density and urbanized, a wide spectrum of affordability and housing types. The northern portion of the city is sort of deep in the heart of Westchester suburbia. The southern portion is along Long Island Sound. So if you have to generalize, the borderline within New Rochelle is I-95. So at least that's simple and clear. The majority of our single family, low density neighborhoods are not within this district. The majority of them are within New York 16, which is represented by Jamal Bowman. So for example, Broadview Avenue, Ragtime, that is within New York 16, not within New York 3. Now, even south of 95, there are plenty of single-family neighborhoods along Davenport Neck and Sutton Manor and Residence Park and Premium Point and Premium Point Park. So I don't want to paint with too broad a brush, but in general, you will find in this portion of the district higher density housing and a wider range of socioeconomic conditions than you might find in the northern half of the city.
So just to be clear, is downtown in the third or the 16th?
It's split.
Downtown, they split downtown.
Yeah, downtown is split. The bulk of it is in the third. But depending on how you define the downtown, portions of it are north of 95.
Any thoughts on why they chose to put the line where they did?
Well, I mean, the most important determinant is equalizing population among districts. So I assume that a line of this kind got them to the number they needed to get to. Um, Beyond that, I'm actually kind of grateful because we've certainly seen district boundaries that are a lot more complicated and convoluted than just following the interstate. So this is a fairly simple line to understand and follow. But I obviously was not in the room
Right.
when the map makers were working this through, so I can only speculate on the specifics of the district boundaries.
You mentioned that having the city divided into multiple districts, whether it's on the state level or the federal level, sort of doubles your opportunities to lobby and get things done. Do you want? How do those dynamics work? Do you wind up playing one off the other? Is there? Do you have to go through like do you have to game plan out what your approach is going to be before you
No,
make those appeals?
listen, we've been very lucky, like to be, when it comes to professional relationships, one happy family. So no, we haven't had to sort of strategize in that way. We've been able to be very candid and open with our delegation, and even sort of seek advice, like, should we go to this person or that person? And everyone is very open about it. I can certainly imagine theoretically a bad relationship between the municipal government and their representatives, or bad relationships among the representatives, which would make things a lot more complicated. But that has not been our experience, at least not lately.
I want to ask about New Rochelle specific issues that you're focused on within this race in the third district. And I want to start with COVID because I know New Rochelle was one of the first outbreak spots in the country, made national news when COVID first hit. Has the city been made whole? Has the city been patched back together since then, or are you still needing some assistance from Washington?
Well, it depends how you look at it. I mean, first, you're certainly right. New Rochelle, at the beginning of the pandemic, had a uniquely difficult experience in the spotlight. But our status as an outlier really lasted only a few weeks. And
Yeah.
after that, we became pretty much like everyone else. In terms of being made whole, the American Rescue Plan made a very significant difference. Meaningful financial support for the city government, as well as financial support that we can in turn provide to our not-for-profit and business sector. So that's been very useful, as well as some of the other relief programs that were instituted during the course of the pandemic. What you can never make up for, though, is the loss of life, the families that are grieving, the upheaval and disruption from 2 years of behaving so abnormally. And also, right now, the sort of unsettling prospect that even though there's every chance that we'll have some additional surges or mini surges because of some gridlock in Washington, the federal government has not armed itself with the funding necessary to make sure that we're ready for the next wave. So I would hope that this will be resolved before the next Congress takes office, but it is a concern to me that right now, despite the Biden administration's best efforts, we don't have a package of funding for what's needed to face the rest of the pandemic.
What about what I'll call the secondary impacts of COVID here in downtown Portchester? I would say 40% of storefronts are closed or in the process of changing hands in one direction or the other. A lot of that happened over the last 2 years with the reduction of business and mobility for people in the middle of COVID. How is New Rochelle doing? Are its businesses back up for the most part?
It's interesting. We certainly do have a number of businesses that have struggled and some that have closed. On the other hand, our business staff members tell me that more restaurants opened during the pandemic than closed, which was a somewhat surprising and encouraging data point. And it's also difficult to tease out pandemic-related impacts from what's going on with respect to economic development and construction, which has had a profound impact on conditions on the street level in the short term, making things more challenging for businesses because so many roads are being torn up and construction cranes are everywhere. It's a difficult environment to navigate. But in the medium and long term, will be very helpful to the business community because it's going to provide a base of customers for goods and services. So I don't know how to isolate the pandemic impacts from those other impacts and figure out what is most responsible.
Mayor Adams in New York City is making a big deal out of getting people back into their offices and workplaces because of the economic boost that will contribute. Is that also playing out in New Rochelle? Are people returning to work? And have you seen? Yeah,
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
have you seen the economic benefits of that if it's happened?
So not to the same degree, because New Rochelle, to our regret, does not have as robust an office presence as we would like. Certainly there is office space and there are people, plenty of people, thousands of people who work in downtown New Rochelle, but it's not a pillar of our economy the same way it is, say, for White Plains or Stamford or certainly New York City.
Sure.
So sort of getting people back into the office is not quite as critical a priority for us. In fact, it's just as likely that there are people working remotely in New Rochelle whose offices are physically based in New York City. So it cuts both ways.
What other city-related issues will you as mayor be focused on in the congressional race in the third? Are there New Rochelle specific issues, or are there national issues that you think will have deep resonance in New Rochelle?
I don't think anything beyond those that we've already referenced.
Okay.
To the extent that we have local projects that could benefit from federal funding, we're looking for a good and effective advocate who will make our case with agencies or through the congressionally directed funding process. To the extent that we have critical regional priorities like Penn Access, we want our representative to be an effective part of the team. And I would expect our representative to share the values and goals of most Democrats with respect to those top line issues, and to be able to work effectively with the congressional leadership and with the administration to make sure that we move forward on those goals.
You and I have done a lot of interviews over the years together. You know that my last question is always the most general, which is there anything that I've missed here? Is there anything in your view of the third district or the prevailing politics or anything at all that might impact this race, whether it's in general or the Westchester portion of it, that I haven't asked you about or that you think needs to be mentioned?
No, I think as usual, you've been pretty comprehensive and organized.
The checks in the mail, Mr. Mayor.
Maybe the only thing I'd add is, at least for most of the Westchester portion of the district, this is the first time we've had an open seat contest in, it's generations, I think. I'm thinking back to Nita Lowey's races. I'm thinking back to Elliot Engel's races. It's really been a long time. Because of course the open seat when Nita Lowey retired no longer covered most of the Sound Shore.
Right.
So for voters in this area, this is uncharted water, and is interesting, and exciting in a way. It gives you a chance to sort of consider each candidate fresh on their own merits, and we're lucky to have a field of strong candidates. And I'm hopeful that whoever emerges will be an effective representative.
My biggest fear as an advocate for the area and its politics is that voters are going to wait until the last minute before they have to make up their minds, if they do so at all, and walk into the polling place and be like, who are these people? Because of the 6 top candidates, only one has appeared on a Westchester ballot before, and that's in a very small portion of Westchester.
Yeah, although my prediction is a voter of the kind you described who's never heard of these people is probably not showing up at the ballot at all.
Well, that's our next challenge, to figure out how to fix that.
The people who will choose to participate are those who have developed a preference for one candidate or another through close observation of the race. That's who participates in primaries.
Well, voter education is one of the main reasons that I decided to launch this podcast. Couldn't have picked a better person to start with, both for educational purposes and also I thank you for being the guinea pig to make sure that all of this technical stuff works out. I hope I can put this on the internet, but I should be able to. But thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
It's a pleasure always, Andrew. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. My thanks to New Rochelle Mayor Noam Bramson and his team, and to you for watching or listening to the 3 on NY-3 podcast. I'm Andrew Whitman. Video of the 3 on NY-3 podcast is available on YouTube. Just search for 3 on NY-3 or my name, Andrew Whitman. Audio of 3 on NY3 can be or should be available on all major podcast outlets. Let me know if there's anything that we're missing. How do you do that? Well, you can email the podcast with any questions, concerns, complaints, or even with words of affirmation, I hope. Our address is 3onny3@gmail. You can also find us on Twitter or Reddit. Search for 3on NY3. I'm Andrew Whitman. We'll see you next time.